I'm Chris Stafford, and this is Art, the podcast where we get to know the women behind their art.
If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll show you what I mean. If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll bring you to your name. If you follow me.
My guest this week is Nazafarin Lotfi, an Iranian multidisciplinary artist who studies how the self and notions of identity are understood in relationship to architecture, landscape, space, and place. She explores humanness in relation to non-human bodies and places that are defined by practices of map-making and gardening. Nazafarin was born in Mashhad, Iran in 1984 during the Iran-Iraq War. She is one of three girls. Her mother was a teacher who introduced her daughters to the arts and literature, and her father owned a small business. Her exposure to the arts was limited as a child before she attended the University of Tehran, where she earned her BA in Industrial Design. With ambitions to further her education in the West, Nazafarin headed to the US and gained an MFA in painting and drawing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. After graduating, she took to teaching, always seeking a life that would reflect her art. She would soon find a place for her work in exhibitions and shows nationally and internationally at venues such as the University Galleries at Illinois State University, Tucson Museum of Art, Art Space, the Phoenix Art Museum, and the Elmhurst Museum of Art, to name just a few. Nazafarin is the recipient of the 2023 Eliza Moore Fellowship for Artistic Excellence. She says of her art, "I think placing myself between two very different aesthetics and ideologies allows me to create a more complicated personal language. And that does more justice to the complexities that I experience as an Iranian female artist living in the US. I grew up with social realist propaganda and had developed a mistrust of it. I come from a traditional society for which history weighs so much, and that can be limiting." Nazafarin is represented by Regards in Chicago. She lives in Tucson, Arizona with her husband Peter, a professor of Persian poetry, and two cats. Hi Nazafarin, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's been a few months now, isn't it, since you were over here in Virginia where we met when you were at Oak Spring Garden Foundation, and you've been traveling quite a bit since then. But explain to people what you were doing over here at Oak Spring, because that's a really important program here. Tell us a little bit more about what you were doing there.
Yeah. So I was Eliza Moore Fellow. I attended Oak Spring. I think I was there in April and May for about 6 weeks. And my project for Oak Spring was about looking at architectural blueprints of gardens, historical gardens, and looking at their spatial organization. And I was working on these drawings during my time up there that really reflected on symmetry, order, and space in relationship to creating the spatial compositions that address utopia or utopic desires. I've been working on the notion of the garden for a number of years now. I think it sort of became very serious at the beginning of COVID, during lockdown. That I was working in my own garden and I was reading about gardens, and I'm Iranian. I come from this tradition of garden making. Specifically, my family comes from Eastern Iran, and it's a pretty dry climate out there. And I live in Arizona. The climate is sort of similar. It's arid. But in Eastern Iran, we have these beautiful green sanctuaries within the desert. And I started thinking about that and in relationship to utopia. And then when I started reading about gardens and looking into literature, that seemed to be a very prominent idea about perfection or ideal place that gardens are supposed to symbolize. So that's how I got into gardens. And then I found out about the Oak Spring Garden Foundation. And then there was the fellowship. I applied for the fellowship. I think I didn't get it the first time I applied. The second time I was invited. I got some stipend to go there, which was really amazing. And I got a whole house for myself. I had 2 studios for myself. And it was just amazing to be there for that time. It was the beginning of the spring, very pleasant weather and a very good environment to work.
Yeah, because as you said, the gardening is an important part of the way you perceive landscape. With a very fresh approach, don't you, in how you bring your art, you embrace that perspective of landscapes and alter people's perspectives in many ways, which art obviously does. And you have a very, I think, interesting philosophy about that. Tell us a little bit more about that, and what brought you to the place you are now in terms of culturally and combining your art and establishing really your own language?
Oh, that's a very good question. I have to start from how it all started. So I moved to the Southwest, to Arizona about 5 years ago. Maybe a little bit more now. And I was fascinated with the kinds of art that I had seen from this region, which I immediately realized there was a lot of landscape painting and photography. And I realized that like the really little bit of knowledge I had from the Southwest came from those imagery. And then when I started reading about imperialism and its relationship to landscape painting, like throughout history, from Dutch paintings to like contemporary landscape painting, particularly from where I live now, I was fascinated by this intersection of power and representation in relationship to places and people. And that's how I started like digging into it a little bit. And then I feel like I went around the globe to come back to my own culture and look at how, like in my culture, nature or landscape has been represented. And I was looking at Persian miniatures, and I saw it was all gardens. They're all gated. There is no representation in classic. I'm talking about like classic Persian miniatures, not contemporary art or not modern art. But in classic Persian miniatures, there was no representation of like the wilderness. The nature is always tamed, contained. And that was very, very interesting to me. And that's sort of how I became because my work previously had to do with architecture. I was always fascinated with architectural elements, architectural spaces, because I understood them as signifiers of human presence or human body. I never made really figurative work in my adult life. And I always used architectural spaces as a way to talk about human condition. And then the garden became this other thing, this other space that is both architectural and natural, a combination of the two worlds that I belong to in one perfect setting that was about human desire, human life, and human presence. So I sort of came to garden making and working on gardens through a very architectural lens, not through learning the names of plants. I mean, I do know plants, especially in where I live. The first thing I did was learning the name of plants and birds, because that was my only way of feeling at home in some way or settling in. But when I was at Oak Spring, I know there were a lot of artists whose work was about specific plants, but I was looking at the whole space, and I was very interested in imagining that a space from above, just like the architect or creator. But in Iran, where you grew up, it's gardening is really part of your cultural world, really, there, isn't it? Is it a privileged world, or are these common spaces that Iranians can enjoy? It depends. So I grew up in a city, but my parents both had a childhood that was combined between the city life and a school and summers in the ancestral village, like their family village, basically. That's where they had fruit trees, like the grandparents' house was still there, and like the kids would be sent to the village for the summer to help with harvesting the fruits and help with basically keeping the land or the garden. But my childhood was mostly spent in the city, but we would visit the village often. And my mom, like that was our relationship to the land, was through her lineage in southern Khorasan. And Khorasan is a state in northeastern Iran that is bordering with Afghanistan and Turkmenistan on the north. So I had this relationship growing up with the land and with fruit trees and like knowing what was in season in when, and like just like having that knowledge that was passed on, that what is what and what do you eat when, and etc. Iran has changed so much since. My dad is an avid gardener at home. Growing up at my time in the 80s and 90s in Iran, most houses had yards. Now they are replaced with apartment buildings, which means there is less private outdoor space and more of public outdoor spaces. But at my time, as a child in Iran, we spent more time in our gardens that were enclosed and private and safe, less time in the public parks, just because of how the environment was. It was a very rough political time in like late 80s, 90s. It wasn't really that comfortable to be outside in the cities, not like mountains or if you wanted to do picnic or anything. Just but I noticed, I was back in Iran over the summer, and I noticed that public spaces are used because of this like condensed population that has no access to a private like yard, because I think because of the weather, maybe people spend a lot of time outside. And that is being replaced with public parks. Each neighborhood has a park. And as you said, yes, gardening is a big part of the culture. And Iran is like most part of Iran have 4 seasons. The weather is not extreme. Like I've lived in Chicago and in Tucson, Arizona. Both places have very extreme temperatures. And in my hometown, Mashhad, or when I went to school in Tehran, the summers would get hot, but you would still have a very pleasant fall, a mild winter, sometimes like a few weeks of very harsh cold or snow, but like a long, nice spring. There was a lot of time to be outside and enjoy and hang out. And people do have, I feel, maybe less and less with the younger generations, but there is a cultural connection with the plants, with like nature. I'm not sure exactly like where that comes from, besides that lineage of like most people grew up in agricultural villages and gradually they moved to the cities, but they didn't leave behind everything. So if there was a cousin or an old aunt or uncle still staying in the village, they would send them some whatever apricots in the summer, or pomegranates in the fall. I think that connection is still in some way present. However, that the cities have changed a lot in even like the past 20 years, past 10 years. Most people are moving to cities. The major cities are getting bigger and more populated because of the drought, because of economy. There are not many jobs in the smaller places. So the whole thing is shifting so much that I can't tell really. I can't say I have a grasp on what's happening there.
Now, as you mentioned, you were born in the 80s in Mashhad, which is in northern Iran, but it was during the Iran-Iraq war. Your mother was a teacher, and I believe she introduced you to literature and the art world, and your dad had a small business as well. So give us a picture, Nazafarin, how art came into your life, what it was like as a child growing up there. Were you an indoor or an outdoor child?
Yeah, so the Iran-Iraq War was present. So as you mentioned, yeah, I'm from Eastern Iran, and Iraq-Iran border is on the west. So I was far from the front line. However, the violence seeped through TV, through lack of access to like food items. Like I remember the line for like rice or milk or other items. And we didn't have TV programs. I think as a child, that was my most concern, that we didn't have anything to watch. And yeah, those are like my major memories. And I remember that I have two older sisters, and we would like make drawings to make like animated cartoons for ourselves. Yeah, and as you mentioned, yeah, my mom, she was a teacher, and she was very interested in history and literature. And through her, she cared a lot about us reading books, and particularly fiction. And I think that was sort of that kind of stimulation I got from reading stories, was my introduction to the possibility of other ways of living. And then poetry was a huge cultural phenomenon in Iran. My parents didn't necessarily read a lot of poetry, but I know like a lot of my friends, they read poetry, like classical Persian poetry with their family. We didn't do that in my home. I was more interested in the new poetry or the modern poetry, Iranian poetry as a teenager. Yeah, those were the beginnings of my interest into creating. And I think what I really wanted and needed was this possibility, this place that I can get out from where I am, this transportability of art that can really take you to a different place. That was my draw into art. And I took painting classes as a kid. I wasn't really into it until I was a teenager. Then I was really into it. And actually, I have to mention that since we talked about landscape painting and photography, I was really into landscape drawing with colored pencil. And that was my most favorite topic to paint or draw as like a 13, 14-year-old or 12-year-old. And then, but doing art at my time was not very encouraged for obvious reason, because you don't get a job, you won't have money, it's not prestigious. It's everyone had to become a doctor or a lawyer or mostly engineer. From my school, I went to a good high school. I was majored in math. And at some point, I think I was 16 or 17, that I figured that I just can't be happy and do anything besides art. I was actually debating between two things, but art became my thing because I felt, well, I didn't know anyone who was an artist. I have to tell you this. So I really didn't have any clue what that meant. The only thing I knew was that none of the people that I don't want to be like are artists. So art was this other thing that more interesting people were doing, but I didn't know them. I only knew ideas about artists from books, that they were radical, revolutionary. They had ideas of their own. They made their own spaces and they lived together. So like these were some very vague ideas that I had, and I thought that was very exciting. So that was my approach to basically changing high school for the last year, which we called it pre-college, to do art, and then do the entrance exam for university for an art major. So Iran is a very different educational system, and especially this is like early 2000s. Now it's different, but back then you had to choose what entrance exam for university to take, and you could only between biology and math, if I remember correctly. And then you could also do art, but I only did art. I skipped math because if you don't study for it, there's no point. Yeah, that's how I sort of switched in my late teens to become an artist.
Did you have the freedom? Because we, over in the West, we regard Iran and Iraq and that region as being somewhat oppressive politically and in terms of education for girls. Was that an issue with you? Did you have the freedom, the liberty to study and Western art and Western philosophy and create your own pathway, so to speak, in those formative years?
I mean, there are limitations. It really depends. Like, I grew up in a major city, in a middle-class family. My family is not religious. So it's very different than someone who grows up in a small town, in a religious family or in a conservative family. It's not really one picture, but I could move at 18 from my hometown to go to Tehran, to go to University of Tehran. My parents were supportive, but that doesn't mean there were no limitations or restrictions. I feel every step of the game has been a struggle. There has been a lot of resistance because at the end, I mean, Iran is Iran. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's not a democracy in a way that I mean, life is very different than in the US. The resources are very limited more than anything else. There's so many opportunities here, and none of that exists over there. In terms of work, in terms of grants, in terms of fellowships, scholarships, like, no, there's like, it's like every step of the game is a struggle for both men and women, but more so for women because there's so many layers of control and patriarchy. They're like so deep embedded in the culture that and in the system that is ruling, that it's a constant battle. But also, again, like, it affects you in different ways depending on the class and wherever you come from, you know, like the family and the city, the region, the time that you grew up there, because now it's like a whole different story than my time. I think like the 16-year-olds of now are really different kinds of people than my 16-year-old and my friends.
So where was the magnet then in drawing you to a world that you could influence and where you could learn, where you could study, where you could, as I said earlier, develop your own language in connecting the pieces of art and nature all together? I mean, what was drawing you then? Because I know you were influenced by the Russian avant-garde artist Malevich, and I think that speaks really to what you're doing now in many ways. Talk us a little bit about that growth and pathway that you took as you graduated from the University of Tehran.
My draw to begin with was creating a space of resistance and creating possibility. And I have to skip over my time at the University of Tehran because I really don't have much to say about it. I did industrial design. It was not good for me. It was not the right choice, but it was really one of the only options. And after the second year of school, or maybe after the first year, I don't remember, I realized I really was not, this was not right for me, but there was no option to switch. And I just decided to go with it, get my degree, and then apply for a Master of Fine Arts or a Fine Arts degree outside of Iran, because at that point I realized that I had no future in that place. It was very difficult. There was a lot of depression going on in my life with my friends. I mean, all of us were very disappointed, specifically that we went to the best university in the country, and it just wasn't the right environment for a young person who is ambitious and who wants to be around like-minded artists and thinkers. It was a rough time. But I had this interest. So I moved to Chicago. I should say that first. I moved to Chicago. I went to the School of the Arts.
How easy was that, though? I mean, it sounds like, I just upped and left and moved to Chicago.
No, it wasn't easy at all. Back then, we had dial-up internet. And I literally had to connect to this thing that is called internet. And it was new. This is 2006, 2007. And I literally Googled artist schools in America. And it took 2 years. The first year, my dad wasn't on board. And the second year, not on board because of he didn't want to send me alone. No, it was financial issues, family issues. It was more that, and I think also maybe it was what do you want to do after you finish your school? What's the plan? Anyways, the second year it worked out, and I did a post-bac program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in painting, and then I got into the MA program after that. It was very difficult because I didn't know anything really. I came from a place that the contemporary art was very local, and it was really Tehran that had galleries. There was one museum, and there were interesting people. My hometown, there was nothing. But still, it was very disconnected from the American contemporary art world. So I had a lot to catch up in a very short amount of time. So the first few years of Chicago were very difficult, actually, and it was very cold. But more than cold, it was very intense and very fast, very fast. That's what I remember still.
Was that the first time for you out of Iran or the first time in the States?
It was my first time in the States. I had traveled outside of Iran before, but it was my first time in the States. And I came all alone with 2 suitcases, and my suitcases didn't arrive on time. So they were shipped to me a couple of days later. It was a very tough trip for a 23-year-old.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be very intimidating, a little bit scary for a young woman to come from a completely different culture into a Western culture and a fast-moving city like Chicago. How was that adjustment for you?
That's the brilliance of being young and naive and stupid. You are not scared. I was not scared at all. I was not intimidated at all. Now, as a 39-year-old, I look back and I'm I would never do that now. I would not just move to even Canada right now with 2 suitcases. I was I'm going to start a new life, and I have nothing.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? The naivety of youth. Sometimes, what you don't know, you're not afraid of. But when you were making that adjustment into college life, though, did you find it as liberating as you had hoped, and for you to be as expressive as you needed to be, and continue your journey to become a professional artist? That there was a future by doing this. This was the pathway.
Not in Chicago. I feel Chicago, the 3 years of school was very stressful. There were moments of joy and really ecstasy, especially in the middle, that just felt so good to be doing what I was doing. But there was a lot of stress, language barrier. How am I going to stay in this country? How am I going to make money? There were so many real things that were hurting me, not being eligible to apply for anything because I was not a U.S. citizen nor a green card holder. And then something else that was very present and difficult for me to navigate was the expectations. Every critique I had to respond for all Iranians, for all Iranian women. I'm just one person who just left. How can I speak for a nation? And as I tried to be very specific, Iranians are different kinds of people, just like any other groups of people. It depends where you come from, what is your class in the society, what your parents did, what is your lineage. It's not one image that everyone like exactly doing the same thing and wants the same thing. So that was very difficult. And the other difficult thing to deal with was that I don't think my classmates, my friends even understood that the burden of all of this, because I mean, they didn't have to respond to anything besides whatever they did in their studio and if they liked it or not and who they looked at. But for me, it was a whole different story. And so it wasn't really that liberating or I mean, it was in some ways, but also there were a lot of baggages. I feel that liberating experience happened for me in college, leaving home and going to Tehran and having roommates. And that was in a way more exciting even. But then it became very dark after a few years that it became real. And because I had done it once, I thought Chicago would be easy, but the kind of challenges I dealt with was so different in Chicago versus Tehran.
And also you were moving to a country that didn't welcome Iranians, so there was a contradiction right there. I think you came over during the travel ban, a very politically very, very difficult time for Iranians to travel to the US. How did you overcome that and then eventually settle here?
So when I came to the US, that was back in 2008. It was the end of the Bush era. Yes, there was a lot of hostility at that time because of, the whole thing with axis of evil. And a lot of my friends did not receive their student visa, and Iran does not have a U.S. consulate or embassy. So I had to travel. I went to Beirut, but there are like different places you can go, like Dubai or Turkey, to do an interview with a U.S. embassy. So that's already like really excludes a lot of people to even do the interview. But in some way, I think I got lucky that I got a student visa the first try. And so my trip was not actually that difficult. I have friends who had also I-20s, like admission letters from schools with full fund, and they didn't get a visa because the officer decided that maybe they wouldn't leave or they wouldn't be a good fit, or for whatever reason, they don't have to give you an answer. So I got lucky. It wasn't difficult for me, but my visa was a single entry visa to the US, which meant I had to buy a one-way ticket. With 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket, I moved to Chicago, basically. And after school, I had 1 year of OPT to stay. And it was a very difficult, stressful time.
What's OPT?
OPT is that optional program. It's the training that you can do, like you stay 1 extra year after your degree for international students, yeah.
So where was your social support then there? Was it with your fellow students, or did you have any other family here to support you through that transition into the wider world once you graduated?
It was the school's community. It was the school I went to, SAIC, has a very robust community in Chicago, and we all supported each other after school. And it's still, I think, one of my main communities in some ways. Yeah.
What was your biggest takeaways then, and as a student, and from what you learnt in Chicago, and how that informed what you might want to do as an artist?
That's a good question. I'm like looking back now. I don't remember back then. When I first graduated, because that was 2011, I don't know. I think what I took, I don't know if it's from the school, or is it something I just had in me, or I learned from my dad, because I actually, in my just previous visit to Iran, that I went to visit my parents because my dad is not doing well and both of my parents are not doing well. I was reminded that this thing I have in me, which I never knew where it came from, comes from him. And that is like, I always identified as a fighter in a way, that, or persistence. And And what I took with me was persistence and just keep working or keep doing what you want to do, even though everyone is telling you that no one cares about what you do. Sometimes it's like that, or there's not much happening per se for artists. But the thing I have had for me is returning to the studio and keep doing what I want to do and pushing myself.
Yes, it's interesting you should use that word persistence, because as you were saying that, I just began thinking that to get where you got and to go through that journey, you must have been somewhat stubborn or willful and certainly determined.
Yeah, I think that is true. And the older I get, and the more I learn about the world and the inequalities of the world and the injustice and the unfairness and everything, I was like, oh, good that when you're young, you don't have that overview arch, because it's so easy to not even start a path and be disappointed for many different reasons. You don't see anyone who shares the same background as you, or they have made it from where you come from, the way you desire, not in a very cliche, uninteresting way. But at this stage, I think that is maybe the interesting thing about art, that you channel your path or you carve your own path. I'm not saying it's easy at all, and but that's art.
Did you meet with any prejudice as an Iranian woman during that period, which was, as we know, politically somewhat sensitive?
So with Iran, it's always politically sensitive. Back then it was Bush era, then it was Obama, and then it was the deal with Iran, and then it was Trump. And in 2017, he imposed the travel ban on a number of Muslim countries, including Iran. My sister got stuck in that liminal immigration path. But at that time, my situation was settled. I didn't personally, myself was not affected. My family members were. Lots of my friends who were traveling and who couldn't come back. A lot of them were students in PhD programs, and they were stuck in Iran or Turkey or Europe because they were suddenly not allowed to come back to finish their study or come back to their families in the US. It was a very, very difficult time, and it still is, and it has been, I think, since the 80s, it has been one thing after another, and we Iranians who are stuck between our own government and the imperial power of the US government, we are being squeezed in the middle without really getting our voice out and having any real representation out. So our stories is sort of really untold and lost in the middle of all these other messy things that are happening to us. There is a lot to the southern border and the humanitarian crisis that is happening here. I know some Afghans and some Iranians also passed through to come to the US, but the story is about Latin America and South Americans coming north. We are not part of that immigration story. And most of us don't cross the southern border to come here, but our immigration story is also, in some ways, it is a crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis in a way that people are separated from each other. Families are really they don't, I have so many friends that they came to the US and they never went back. Their parents died. They couldn't participate in their funerals. They couldn't see them in their last days or months. It's painful. There's a lot of pain. And it's mostly because you get a single entry visa, then you have a work visa. You can't travel with a work visa, or you have an artist visa that you have to renew every 3 years. And that takes so much money. And you don't have any extra money or time to go. And if you go, you might not be able to come back. There are so many layers and challenges.
So art then has been a vehicle for you that represents so many different aspects of your life. And I read somewhere that you said that art is about taking the risk of engaging in something somewhat ridiculous and irrational. unpack that for us, Nazafarin, and how this relates to your work, what you are trying to achieve in that world that can be somewhat ridiculous and irrational as an Iranian woman in the US.
Yeah, the absurdity of art sometimes is very interesting to me and stimulating, and sometimes that is like what bothers me so much. But I came to art through a real existential drive. It seemed like art was the answer to many things, right or wrong, and I still debate that. So my approach to art making is through that lens. I'm just coming back from this 2-week program in LA, and we saw so many amazing artists, but I kept hearing from most of these artists, where most of them are the most famous artists that you see in all museums, and they show with Gagosian or this gallery or that gallery. They're at the top of the game. And one thing I kept hearing over and over was that I'm the first person who did this, or this person made the most monumental of this. There's so much like emphasis on how to make things, and being the first person to discover something or being the first person to make that. And it's just like so boring to me. I'm like, okay, welcome to American art again. 10 years after graduation, it was really refreshing and fun. But also it's like, okay, like, I don't know if I really care, because none of them talked about anything about humans in a way, like what it means to be a human, what it means to be alive. And in my way of being a human, an Iranian woman human, and being alive, I think there's a lot of pain in it. In my experience, there's a lot of pain. And at this point, and with everything we've been through since last September, I feel like I have to talk about it. I found absurdity a very interesting way to engage in the world and think about these issues and human condition and the absurdity of the lives of many people, experiencing the kind of oppression that I did and my family did and my friends did, and being stuck in this liminal world between places. So absurdity is relevant in some way, but also I was also very interested in like possibility. This like you can like create things. Like I'm not talking about changing the world in that scale. I'm actually way more, since 2017, I'm way more invested and interested in doing very small things and very local things, and work with people and offer people things, but in a very small scale. So that is like also my interest in utopia and this possibility that I was talking about, or carving a space, creating a space, which is, I think, part of my story. That's why I find the gardens beautiful, because there are these green sanctuaries in this desert, in this bare desert. They moved water literally for miles and miles. They dug these underground channels and brought water from the mountains to the desert to irrigate the land and create this beautiful microclimate. And that is the possibility that I'm talking about. That is the possibility that Russian constructivists in some way were dealing with in their compositions with geometric shapes. And I was interested in abstraction always because I was interested in a space, and I wasn't interested in figuration and representation, particularly in Chicago when I was younger. I felt any figure I made, it was a very specific kind of figure. It was a different time back then, though. That's like 2008, 9. And then this whole figuration started in 2015, 16, I think. So it's a wave after my time as a student. And I don't know if I would be interested in figuration, even if I went to school in 2018 or 17. I think philosophically, it's not representation is not that interesting to me. I'm interested in a more open-ended narrative.
And you trained as a painter originally, and And you moved into different mediums, of course, so including paper mache, some of your installations you use a lot of. What are your preferred mediums now then?
I do make sculptural works mostly. Yeah, I did get an MFA in painting. I was never a traditional painter, though. Even my paintings from that time are very collage based, very process based, lots of layering. I always liked building things, and I knew I'm a builder. I have to build things, but I couldn't figure out how. And I don't like to work in a factory or in a workshop with other people. So I had to come up with a material, with a formula in a way that I could make sculptures in my own studio without needing help from people. That's how I found paper mache, because it's light, it's easy to use. You don't need a chainsaw. You don't need a welding machine or whatever. You don't need a table saw. So that's how paper mache came to my life. And I learned how to use it from YouTube, I think, and from this website, Ultimate Paper Mache.
All right. Well, you've really put it to good use now. So what we haven't done is joined up the dots from when you graduated. So where did you go after Chicago? What was that journey like for you, getting out into the real world and finding work and finding a future here in the States?
So I got to have a solo show right after graduation, which was very lucky. I got into a group show in a good gallery in Chicago, just out of the MFA show. And then I got a solo show a few months after that. So it sort of was a very nice ending of a school entry to real world. I had a lot of challenges in the real art world, the gallery that I really liked, and I had a show with right after school closed. Not long after, because this is still after the 2008 crash. And then I worked with another gallery in Chicago. So I was I started showing right after school. And then I got married a few years after with my partner. We are still together. And I was in Chicago for 10 years overall. I was teaching. I had a studio. I was showing regularly in the city. And then my partner finally finished his PhD after many years. And he got a tenure track position at the University of Arizona. And in 2017-18, we moved to Tucson together for his career, for his job. And we're still here. I'm not sure how long we're going to stay here because Tucson is not like Chicago or LA or New York at all. It's a very small community, art community, not many galleries, or maybe just a couple of galleries. So it's a lot less goes on here in terms of arts and culture. But on the other hand, it's the most magical place I've lived in terms of beauty and landscape. It's a slower pace. It has allowed me to have a garden, to really reconnect with a lot of things I always loved from those summer times in the village, looking at the sky and seeing the Milky Way. I can do it here. I can get back. I did get back to some of my hobbies from younger years. We got a telescope. Now we have two. So it's a different lifestyle, and it's been fruitful in some ways, but at the same time, I don't meet many artists. I travel a lot for that reason. I go to residences for that reason.
And your husband, Austin, is a professor of Persian poetry. So you've really come full circle with the poetry then.
I think so. It's very strange.
Yeah.
But yeah, it feels that way. Yeah, we met in Chicago. We met at a party in Chicago, and he was this white guy who was speaking Farsi. I'm like, what? That was the first time I had met a non-Iranian speaking Farsi, to be honest. Yeah, that's how we started speaking, talking, and gradually, we started hanging out. And 12 years later, we're here.
And you're still together. That's wonderful. And so you were actually making money out of your art as soon as you graduated then, because a lot of students, might be waiting tables or doing something else in life to make ends meet before they get established as an artist. But it seems that it was seamless for you to be profitable then once you graduated.
To be honest, I wouldn't call it that way. My work was very cheap at that time, and it was not, I could not like afford living just selling work at all. I always taught. I started teaching just maybe 6 months after coming out of school. In the spring semester of the year after, I was teaching, and I taught at different colleges as an adjunct to be able to afford my life. So I never actually like made that much money from my art. And then the gallery closed. And then my relationship with this other gallery right after that was out of the country wasn't good. And I pulled my work back. I just didn't think it was worth it. And I was young, and I felt like this is not the path I wanted to pursue, which thankfully that gallery, as I got really like a bad vibe from them, they closed in a few years. No regrets on that. And I work with a gallery now that is also based in Chicago regards, but I don't like sell that much work to be relying on it at all. So I'm not a profitable artist in any way.
That was at that time then, when once you graduated, you determined that you would stay in the US, that you were not going to go back to Iran.
Yes. Yeah. And then meeting Austin, it was like we wanted to be together, and then we eventually married. Yeah.
Love will do it to you, Nazafarin.
Yeah. And it's much easier to be an artist it's such a hard, at this point, even if you teach as an adjunct, you make some money, which is, I think that's like one of the worst things we all do, because you get no benefits, now some schools are doing continuing contracts, like you teach for a few years as an adjunct with one contract. But my time, it was every semester you had to renew your contract. So it was really not a stable situation. But yeah, we all find our way. And to be honest, I think it's really unfair, the kind of lives artists have to do in order to just survive. Because we are an important part of the culture, like artists are important, very important in the culture, but there's no value for the work we do. And the artists who make money in like an average scale are just literally making the same thing over and over. And a lot of them are producing the work that the market wants from them to produce, just in order to make a living. And I can't blame them for anything, because how do you make money otherwise? Like, I got into teaching. I have a partner now who has a full-time job now. And we live in Tucson, which is a cheap city, especially before COVID. It was very cheap. So yeah, it's a challenge for everyone, I think.
In terms of your art, though, and the message of your art, how would you describe how it's evolved, and how would you describe yourself as an artist now?
That is a very difficult question. I never like to separate art from life. So I do think that, especially the good thing about living in Tucson and not having any affiliations with any institution that forces you to do certain things, I feel like I have been able to live a life that is a reflection of my art in a way, that there is curiosity in it, there is daydreaming, reverie, there is also focus on other people, giving back to people, creating a space for other people. I think these are the themes I work with in my drawings, creating a space, making void become a place, and making places to become a void, the tension that we previously described in relationship to absurdity. And also utopia, which I always remind myself that utopia is an imagined landscape. So therefore it is an impossible place. But I think in my real life, I'm like trying to like do like these like little steps towards like creating spaces for other people, or doing things that maybe there is not much time for other people to do in their lives, like from like having a deeper relationship with nature, or spending enough time with non-human beings, and being surrounded by human beings who are not necessarily artists or in the art world, but they deserve attention and they deserve a space, and I feel comfortable to be around them and I identify with them. And specifically, I'm talking about refugee status communities that I started working with since I moved to Tucson, actually. But more seriously, by the end of COVID, I started mentoring youth from refugee status communities, and then the situation in Afghanistan happened, and then there was a surge of Afghans coming to the U.S., and a lot of them were resettled in Tucson. Arizona is very big in resettlement for some reason. And that my work became more serious gradually. And then I thought about it, oh, look at this. This is another garden. It's just you put the seeds in the ground and then it just starts growing. But it is like everything I do is a future-oriented project. So you can't give up because you have to keep going. I started a mentorship program called Hamrah Arts Club, I think back into 2021, if I'm correct. Because I met these younger artists coming from Afghanistan and they were looking for other artists or other community members who are like-minded and interested in creativity. And that grew and became a thing that is still happening. We're meeting on Sunday with the remaining members because a lot of them moved on from Arizona to other cities. But that is like, it's not an art project, but sometimes it is. It is a placemaking project, and I like to be a part of it. And because I'm older and I know people and I have access to resources, I get to be the one who organizes everything.
Well, your art is very much interwoven into your life and your lifestyle then, and with the mentoring, with everything that you do. I'm wondering if you have a vision for the future, what impact you would like to have with your language, your ideals of art, and how it is integrated in life?
I think integrity is one thing that I always thought about and comes to mind, that like integrity of like believing in something and working towards it, even if it takes a long time to get there. And I know even as a younger person that what I was interested in was maybe a little bit deeper than what like my friends my age, like back when I was in my 20s, were thinking about or interested in engaging. So I always knew that my work takes time to really like get the attention it deserves or get understood for what it actually is, not just its formal qualities, because that's the other, like something else to deal with. But patience and integrity are, I think, elements very important in my practice.
I do find it very interesting looking at your art because it really does make you think that it's something much more than that piece of art, way more. I mean, socially and politically, of course, for you. So where can we find any exhibitions, any shows that are upcoming, Nazafarin?
Yes, I will be back in Chicago in the spring for my third solo show with Regards Gallery in Chicago. It's one of the best galleries in Chicago, I think. They show really good artists and they're my friends, obviously. I like them a lot. Mike and Natalie Shu, they run the gallery, and this will be my third show. The date is not confirmed, but it's probably around April. So I'm excited to get back to the studio from Monday. I have some ideas. I know it'll be a more sculptural show, but yeah, I'm going to start working on it from Monday.
Well, the very best of luck, and long may your shows continue, Nazafarin. Thank you so much for being my guest on the show this week.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the conversation.
And, of course, you'll find links to Nazafarin's website and her social media in the show notes accompanying this episode. And you can also find us on social media at the AART Podcast. That's the Art with 2 A's on Instagram, where you can leave your comments and questions there and any suggestions you have for guests. The AART Podcast is produced and edited by me, Chris Stafford, and as a Hollowell Studios production. Next week on the show, I'll be talking to the English artist Amy Dury. And in the coming weeks, we'll be hearing from women behind the camera including cinematographers Gretchen Warthen and Ashley Barron. So I do hope you'll join me for more conversations from women around the world of visual arts. Until the next time, thank you for listening.